Good evening, everyone. This is Mike. I'd like to wish everyone a happy Eve of All Hallows, and I hope that the ghosts and the ghouls and the witches are keeping you entertained. I have my protection with me, just in case, because you never know what might be hanging around outside. So, I just realized when I started this, my coat hanging here back in the doorway with the shoes underneath it, it looks like there's a little person hanging on the doorknob, but I assure you it's just a coat. It does look kind of funny though, doesn't it? So why am I here? I don't know. I thought that I would finish out the month of October by talking about the horror films and science fiction films that I watched this month. I ended up doing just one video during Halloween. I was thinking about doing more and I got lazy. But anyway, so here's summing up what I did in the month of October. I actually watched a total of 40 films. I keep track of everything now on my letterbox page, so I remember, because I have such a bad memory. I give myself a way of remembering exactly what I watched and writing little reviews now and then, which I'd like to do more of. So I just wrote down all the ones that were horror films, and I'll show you. Most of them I watched at home. There were some that I watched at the theater, and some of the films during October, none of the horror films, but I did watch some of them in my film class. And tomorrow night is the last night of my film class, and we're going to be watching another classic horror film, or the first one for this class anyway. It's Island of Lost Souls with Bela Lugosi and Charles Laughton, which I have not seen in a very, very long time. I bought the Criterion copy upstairs in my TV room. I think the last time they had the sale, I finally got around to picking it up. I haven't seen that movie in probably 35, maybe 40 years. So it'll be a real treat to see it tomorrow night in class and have a discussion. And then I'll probably come home later and watch the extra features and maybe the commentary and all that sort of thing, depending on what it has on the box set. So that'll be nice. So I'm going to go through the month here and just talk briefly about the films that I watched, horror films, science fiction. Starting off with this 1959 Hammer film, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, starring a wonderful German actor named Anton Diffring. And Christopher Lee is also in it, along with Hazel Court. Very well-made film, although it's not exactly one of the most thrilling of Hammer films, but it's still very good. It was a remake of a 1940s film called The Man in Half Moon Street, which I remember seeing when I was a kid. And it's about a man who has found basically a way to stay youthful, kind of like Dorian Gray. Unfortunately, he has to get a transplant of someone's gland, pituitary gland or some kind of gland, every 10 years. Otherwise, he turns into an old codger like me. Okay, so that was the first one. Then I saw Pet Sematary, starring, among other people, one of my favorite actresses, Denise Crosby, one of my favorite Star Trek actresses. And this was a bloody mess, let me tell you. I didn't know what to expect, really, but I've never read the book by Stephen King, but it was a very well-made horror film. I'm not sure I'll be watching it again anytime soon. But yeah, it had a lot of atmosphere. Then I watched this movie called, what's it called? Track of the Vampire, which is on this nice little double feature along with Nightmare Castle. And Track of the Vampire is also known under the title of Bloodbath, and it's a vampire movie. It's kind of a convoluted script, and there is probably because it was made and remade about 2 different times. They kept changing directors and cutting and resplicing and redoing things. It's kind of a convoluted mess, but it still has a lot of atmosphere. And the star of the film is a good actor named William Campbell, who also did a lot of low-budget genre-type films and was also in Star Trek. So that was kind of fun to watch. I had a good time watching that. Now to a very good film called The Skull from 1960. What was the year of this? I've already forgotten. 68, no, 65. 65. It's not a Hammer film. It was made by a British studio called Amicus, which at the time was trying to compete with Hammer films for doing really atmospheric horror movies. And this is very, very atmospheric. And it stars Peter Cushing, Patrick Wymark, and Christopher Lee. And I was surprised at how good it was. I'm sorry that it took me that long to watch it. It is a very, very well done and atmospheric film. And Peter Cushing is terrific. And of course, Christopher Lee is also terrific, but the focus is mainly on Peter Cushing, and he is absolutely wonderful and highly recommended. Okay, then we get to Christopher Lee once again. This is another version of Count Dracula, directed by Jess Franco in 1971, 71, 72. Yeah, 1970, I guess. Sorry. Okay. So what they wanted to do here, Jess Franco wanted to make a by-the-book film of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He tried to do it as much by the book as he possibly could. So he got Christopher Lee interested because Lee had always wanted to do something that was more an accurate representation of Bram Stoker's novel. And mixed results. It starts out very well. Christopher Lee is good. Unfortunately, he's really not in it all that much, and it kind of gets very slow and not all that thrilling toward the end. But it is absolutely worth seeing. It is a valiant effort and something that meant a lot to Christopher Lee. So for that reason, I would recommend it to all of his fans. Okay. Then we go to a film that I talked about when I did my top 10 list of vampire films, The Return of Dracula, which I won't talk about anymore, but it's always been a favorite of mine. It was starred Francis Lederer, who was a great actor from the silent films and had a great accent, kind of like a Lugosi type accent, and a very interesting take on Dracula in the modern age, or at least in 1958, with a beautiful actress co-starring. Her name was Norma Eberhard. It was very beautiful and a very interesting actress. Okay, another one of my favorites. Then we get to, this is off the Hammer, one of these Hammer 8-film collections, and it has a lot of things on here like Rise of Dracula, Curse of the Werewolf. One I had never seen was The Evil of Frankenstein, another take on the Frankenstein story made in 1964, starring, once again, Peter Cushing in a great performance as Mr. Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. Very colorful and very well done. The guy who played the monster was a guy named Kiwi Kingston. And I have to admit, I really enjoyed it. It had a certain amount of violence in it, but it wasn't overdone and choked with atmosphere. Really beautiful, beautiful to look at. So yeah, if you haven't seen The Evil of Frankenstein, I would give it a look. Then we go to the other end of the spectrum from good to terrible. This is a great bad science fiction movie called The Astounding She-Monster from 1958. The Astounding She-Monster. Which the only thing astounding about this chick is the fact that anybody might think she's astounding. Played by the actress who played the part was someone named Shirley Kilpatrick. I don't know if she ever had any kind of a career before or after this film, but she was a very voluptuous lady, great body. She was wearing this silver lame bodysuit, which was skin tight, and supposedly on the first day of shooting, she ripped out the back part of the suit. So from then on, they didn't have enough money or enough time to repair it. So from then on, she couldn't turn around, right? So she was sort of walking forward, then backing up instead of turning around. It was very strange. It's all about a woman comes from this planet somewhere in outer space to Earth to supposedly try to make friends with Earth people because they're afraid that the people of Earth are getting so violent that they might end up destroying themselves. I'm stuttering like crazy. I need a drink. Thank you. Now I feel better. Anyway, so that's combined with another story about a kidnapping of a rich woman these gangsters take this woman out in the woods, and they're sort of hiding out in this cabin where the she-monster is following everybody around and climbing through windows and all sorts of nonsense. Unfortunately, every time the she-monster touches anything that's living, whether it's human or animal, they die of radium poisoning. So it's kind of hard to make friends. And she doesn't say anything, so nobody knows why she's there. It's quite bad, but it's wonderful. So if you want to have a good time, The Astounding She-Monster. Then we go from bad to even worse with this wonderful double feature of The Horror of Party Beach and The Curse of the Living Corpse. Two films released in 1964, directed by the same director, a guy named Del Tenney. I think he made just a couple of other films besides this. Several years later, he did something called I Eat Your Skin, which I have not seen. But yeah, Del Tenney did these two films. The Horror of Party Beach is one of the most gloriously bad movies ever made. I absolutely love it. It's like the gift that keeps on giving. You can watch this again and again and again, laugh your ass off, and still have a great time. The Curse of the Living Corpse is a little bit different. Of course, The Horror of Party Beach is just a takeoff on the at that time the current trend of beach party films, and they wanted to combine it with horror to make it something the kids would all flock to, which they did. So it was made for something like $38, and they made millions, so they did very well. The Curse of the Living Corpse was quite different than the Horror of Party Beach. It was a period film made in the 1830s. It had very kind of Shakespearean dialogue, and it was sort of like a moody gothic type horror film about a man who wouldn't stay dead, and very different in tone than the Horror of Party Beach, but not nearly as much fun. Now, there are no known actors at all in the Horror of Party Beach, but The Curse of the Living Corpse had one actor who became very well known. That was Roy Scheider in his very first film, in 1964. It also had an actress named Candice Hilligoss, who of course is very well known for having been in the film Carnival of Souls 2 years before, and I think that was the only other film that she ever did. She may have done a little bit of television, but pretty much her career started and stopped with those two movies. So that is your other chance to see Candice Hilligoss, only in a very small supporting role. She's not nearly as effective in The Curse of the Living Corpse. I thought that when she did Carnival of Souls, she was actually very good and very believable. In this one, she seems very forced. Although she looks terrific, but you know, what the hell. So the next movie I watched is on this compilation of 4 horror movies. It's called Swamp Thing from 19 something, I don't know. Swamp Thing starring Adrienne Barbeau, directed by, who directed it? I don't know who directed it. Somebody directed it. 1982, which actually was a lot of fun. I've had this sitting on the shelf for a while, and I just never got around to watching it. And yeah, I had a great time watching Swamp Thing. She's a great heroine, and she looks terrific. So that was fun. Another double feature. These are one of these. No, they're not Hammer films. No, they're not. One of them is an English film called The Circus of Horrors. Once again, starring Anton Diffring in a very good horror movie about a plastic surgeon who runs afoul of the police, and he has to flee. So he hides out in a circus, which is owned by Donald Pleasance, and he ends up owning the circus and doing plastic surgery on the side and killing people right and left. It's great fun. And the co-feature is another Christopher Lee movie called Theater of Death, which actually a great performance by Christopher Lee. This is back in 1967, but the film actually wasn't all that good. Beautiful to look at, but it didn't have that much going for it as far as a great story. It just didn't make any sense. So I can't recommend that beyond people who just want to see Christopher Lee as the good actor that he obviously is. So I'll give that sort of a half and half recommendation. Then we get to another very bad kind of a science fiction monster movie that I've had sitting on the shelf for a while. Finally got around to watching Teenage Monster from the year 1957 or 58, one of the two, doesn't matter, starring an actress named Anne Gwynn, who was very well known in a lot of B pictures from Universal back in the 1940s, and including a couple of horror films like House of Dracula. Very good actress. Or was it House of Frankenstein? That was one of the two. I don't know. But she still looks good in this. She's playing the mother. This takes place in the Old West, right? This is an Old West horror movie. She plays a mother of a little boy who is he turns into a werewolf because, well, here's the story. Here's the story, right? Okay, so Anne Gwynn and her husband and her little boy are living out in the Old West, and the husband owns a gold mine where the little boy goes to help him look for gold, while Anne Gwynn stays home and takes care of the house. One day, a meteor appears out of nowhere, well, out of the sky, and it lands right on top of Dad, right? So Dad's dead, and the little boy being close by isn't killed, but he's got burns all over his face. So Anne Gwyn is screaming, screaming, and then the movie starts up 7 years later. The little boy is now a teenager, and somehow he has survived, but he has turned into a werewolf, which makes perfect sense. Get hit by a meteor, turn into a werewolf. And she's managed to keep him living in this cave all these years. Unfortunately, he gets upset sometimes, and he goes out and kills people for no particular reason, because he doesn't need blood or anything like that. He just has this urge to kill. So it gets very crazy after that. Co-starring is a young actress named Gloria Castillo, who made a couple of B films back in the 1950s, things like Attack of the Invasion of the Saucermen, Reform School Girl, and her first film was a classic film called The Night of the Hunter. And unfortunately, she didn't keep her career going very long. She died very young, but she's seen to very good advantage in this. So yeah, Teenage Monster, another recommendation for a good bad film. And finally, last night, the last horror film that I watched, it's one of my favorites. It's called Mark of the Vampire, starring Bela Lugosi. Well, okay, Mark of the Vampire. Now, I've always talked about this when I do any kind of a top 10 thing, top 10 vampire films. I always talk about this one as being one of my favorites. I still love it, but I watched it very closely last night, and I realized why a lot of people don't like it and why it was not a success when it first came out. It was directed by Todd Browning. This was 1935, and Todd Browning was doing a remake of a film he had made in the silent era called London After Midnight with Lon Chaney. So he made this film, and it has a story which ends up being very unbelievable, and it's very convoluted, and I won't spoil it for anybody if you haven't seen it, but Bela Lugosi plays a vampire. It's the second time he played a vampire, very much like Dracula, after he did Dracula in 1931. And he does a good job, but he's only in it for a few minutes. I think the film itself is only 60 minutes long, and I think you see Bela Lugosi for maybe 10 or 12 minutes, if that much. When he's in it, and also with the young woman who plays his daughter, also a vampire, a wonderful actress named Carol Borland, who's in that photo there. Her only film, the only film she ever did, when they are in the film, it's wonderful, and it's choked with atmosphere, and it should be, because the cinematographer was a man named James Wong Howe, who went on to have a great career as a cinematographer. But it's filled with a lot of scenes that are just endless talking and not much action. It has a lot of comedy, servant girls running, screaming through the castle, which take away from the atmosphere of the horror. And it's interesting that Carol Borland only did one film and never went on to do anything else. But her image is one of the most well-known in horror films. Here she is again on the cover of this wonderful book, Dark Romance, with Bela Lugosi from that film. She's on the cover of this book, Classics of the Horror Film, and she actually looks a lot like Theda Bara, who was the original vampire, although a different kind of vampire. 20 years earlier, Theda Bara looked like that in 1915 when she did this film called Sin. And she looks like she could be the mother of Carol Borland. And Carol Borland looks like she could be the mother of Vampira or Barbara Steele. So that was kind of the beginning of that image of the vampire woman with a pale white face and huge eyes and long black hair hanging down. And yeah, so I still love Mark of the Vampire. I think that it deserves to be appreciated for the good things that it has, but it really, all things put together, it's not a great film. It is kind of a failure as a horror film. Okay, I'm babbling. It's almost 20 minutes here. Thank you for listening, and let me know what you think about anything I've talked about here. And I hope that you have a good Halloween. Good night.